Hey guys, hope you're doing well. Today's lesson is going to be on radians. We're going to call this Unit A, Lesson 2. So we're going to talk about our radian families and then evaluating trig functions that are in radians. So first of all, let's start with our 90-degree family. 90 degrees, as you probably know, is pi over 2 radians. Well, where does that come from? If we start here at 0 and go all the way around the unit circle, that's 2 pi. Okay, so if we go halfway around the unit circle, that's going to be half of 2 pi, or that's going to be pi. And then half of that is pi over 2. So that's where pi over 2 radians is equivalent to 90 degrees. On the bottom half now, we go pi plus pi over 2. So that's 1.5 or 3 pi over 2 radians. So there's our quadrantals, all right, our 90-degree family or our pi over 2 family. Moving on now to 30 degrees. So 30 degrees in the first quadrant, approximately right there, we're going to call that pi over 6. Now it gets a little bit more challenging in the second and the third and the fourth quadrants. Okay, so what we're going to do to calculate that is we're going to remember that 180 degrees is equivalent to pi. Well, I've got a denominator of 6 here, so that is equivalent to 6 pi over 6. So how do we come up with this value? Well, I need to take that 6 pi over 6, and I need to subtract pi over 6. So that's going to give me 5 pi over 6. Okay, so this angle right here is 5 pi over 6. Well, what about in the third quadrant? Well, in the third quadrant, I'm going to take that 6 pi over 6. I'm going to add pi over 6. All right, so that's going to give me 7 pi over 6. Now, fortunately, we don't really have to do this every single time. There's a nice pattern that develops that we're going to use here and in the subsequent families. And that is simply, if I want an angle in the second quadrant, I'm going to take my denominator and subtract 1. So 6 minus 1 is 5, and that's how you get that 5 pi. Here in the third quadrant, you're going to take your denominator and add 1. So the numerator is 1 more than the denominator. Now, in the fourth quadrant, I have to take 2 pi and subtract pi over 6. So again, if we get our common denominators, that's going to be 12 pi over 6 minus pi over 6. Well, what's that going to be? That's going to be 11 pi over 6. So what I remember in the fourth quadrant is that the numerator is almost double the denominator, almost. So here's our pi over 6 family in those quadrants. So basically, you need to recognize that pi over 6 is always going to give you a 30-degree reference angle, and then we need to know which quadrant that particular angle lies. Okay, so let's move on with 45 degrees. We're going to go a little bit quicker on this one. So 45 degrees, first quadrant, pi over 4. Pretty straightforward. Okay, so what's that going to be in our other quadrants? Well, in the second quadrant, let's apply that rule we just talked about. The numerator is 1 less than the denominator. So since my denominator is 4, that's simply going to be 3 pi over 4. In the third quadrant, your numerator is going to be 1 more in the denominator, so that's going to be 5 pi over 4. And the fourth quadrant is going to be almost double. So 4 times 2 is 8, subtract 1, and that's going to give you 7 pi over 4. So there's your pi over 4 radian family in the quadrants. And lastly, we've got 60 degrees. So that's going to give me pi over 3. So in the second quadrant, numerator is 1 less than the denominator. So that's going to be 2 pi over 3. Third quadrant, numerator is 1 more than the denominator. So that's going to be 4 pi over 3. And then almost double. So that's going to be 5 pi over 3. So again, anytime you see a pi over 3, you know it's going to be a 60-degree reference angle. We just need to know where these angles are. So we can apply our all sine, tangent, cosine, ASTC to determine positive or negative. Okay, let's try some examples here. All right, sine of pi. So this is a quadrantal, and there's a couple ways you can go about doing this. Some teachers prefer to use your trig graph. Some teachers use a unit circle. I'm just going to use a unit circle here. So sine of pi, where's pi? Pi is right here. Okay, so I'm talking about this point. What I like to remember is that sine theta is equal to the y value. So what is the y value right there? Well, that y value is 0. So sine of pi is 0. Tangent pi over 2. Okay, pi over 2, another quadrantal. So I'm looking right here. Now, one of the things that I like to use to help me here visualize tangent on the quadrantals, this is on the vertical. Remember, tangent is sine over cosine. Think of it as y over x. Think of that as slope. So the slope of all vertical lines is undefined, which means tangent here and here is going to be undefined. So since pi over 2 is on that, tangent of pi over 2 is undefined. Okay, you can apply the same principle to the horizontal, and tangent of 0 and tangent of pi will equal 0. Okay, cosine of negative 3 pi over 2. So negative 3 pi over 2 means I'm going the negative direction here, which means I end up right there at that point. So again, cosine. Cosine, if you remember, is the x-coordinate. That coordinate right there is 0, 1. The x-coordinate is 0. So cosine of negative 3 pi over 2 is going to be 0. Okay, let's get into our triangles. So for this particular question, you see sine 7 pi over 6. Well, the first thing I like to do, let's just establish what the reference angle is. Anytime you see a pi over 6, you think, oh, hey, 30 degrees. Now from lesson 1, those special right triangles, you learned that sine of 30 is 1/2. So now I know my answer is going to be 1/2, but it could be negative. So what we have to do next, and this is where radian families come into play, ASTC. Now you need to know, well, where is 7 pi over 6? So when I think of quickly, oh, hey, that numerator is 1 more than the denominator, so that must be in the third quadrant. Well, that's tangent's quadrant. I'm looking for sine. That means my answer's got to be negative. So sine of 7 pi over 6 is negative 1/2. All right, let's try some more like that. Cosine, negative pi over 6. Again, you see pi over 6, you think, oh, 30 degrees. And I know from my triangles that cosine of 30 degrees is square root 3 over 2. So what we haven't established yet is that positive or negative? So we always do ASTC. Think about what quadrant we're in. Well, negative pi over 6 means I went that way. That's cosine's quadrant. I want cosine, so my answer is just positive square root 3 over 2. Okay, tangent, 5 pi over 4. So now I see a pi over 4. Again, ignore the 5 for now. You just see pi over 4, and what you guys think of is 45 degrees. Okay, well, what's tangent of 45 degrees? Well, that's 1. So what I haven't done yet is I haven't taken this into consideration. Where is 5 pi over 4? Well, 5 pi over 4 is, the numerator is 1 more than the denominator, so I'm in the third quadrant. Well, that's tangent's quadrant. Tangent is the function I'm dealing with, so that is just my answer, positive 1. Okay, next example here, sine 3 pi over 4. So again, I see pi over 4, I'm thinking 45 degrees. I know from my triangles that sine of 45 degrees is 1 over square root 2. So what I haven't done yet is I haven't figured out, well, hey, where is this? Is my answer positive or negative? So I've got 3 pi over 2. That numerator is 1 less than denominator. That puts me in the second quadrant. That's sine, so my answer's got to be positive. All right, cosine, negative 11 pi over 6. That looks really complicated, okay? But it's not that bad because, again, just look at the pi over 6. Pi over 6 you recognize has got to be 30 degrees. Now you need to use your triangles, or hopefully you have this memorized. Cosine of 30 degrees is square root 3 over 2. So I'm not going to circle it yet because I need to know if that's positive or negative. ASTC, negative 11 pi over 6. All right, so this is a little bit challenging. Negative means I'm going this direction. And 11 pi over 6 is almost 2, so I'm actually going to stop right here. Well, that's all. All of them are positive, so it doesn't really matter what function I'm dealing with. I know my final answer has to be positive. All right, a couple more. Wrap it up. Okay, so once again, we see that pi over 6. We've seen this a couple times already. That's 30 degrees. From your triangles, what is tangent of 30? Well, that's 1 over square root 3. Now, let's see, is my answer positive or negative? So 5 pi over 6. Where's 5 pi over 6? Okay, that's second quadrant. That's sine. That's tangent. So it's not the same. Answer is going to be negative. So I know tangent of 5 pi over 6 is equal to negative 1 over square root 3. And the last one. 4 pi over 3, sine of 4 pi over 3. You see pi over 3, you think 60 degree reference angle. So from your triangle, sine of 60, that's square root 3 over 2. Is it positive or negative? Let's find out. 4 pi over 3. Where is that? The numerator is 1 more than the denominator. That puts me in the third quadrant. That's tangent. That's sine. Answer's got to be negative. Okay. So I think that's enough with the examples. We've got 2 homework assignments for Unit A, Lesson 2. Answer keys will be provided. And then when you finish those up, you're going to go to Delta Math and do the Delta Math assignment for Unit A, Lesson 2. As usual, if you have any questions whatsoever, please reach out to your teacher. We're more than willing to help. We know this is kind of a tough time, so we just hope you guys are doing well.